Hello and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Ollie Lam.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode.
Okay, hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast. I'm your host for today, Mike Castle, and I'm very pleased today to be joined by Dr Marink Reedijk, current head coach of RSC Anderlecht Futures team. Marink, I'm going to give you a moment to introduce yourself in just a second, but before that, I think it's probably worth me telling the listeners that this is a bit of role reversal for you and I, because typically our experiences together have been you asking me lots of questions about my coaching, about my thinking and what's going on in life and stuff like that. So this is a bit of a change from the norm for us. It's almost an opportunity for me to get my own back a little bit and hear a little bit more about you, which is nice. So I'm looking forward to that very much so. But why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself? Why don't we maybe start at the beginning? Where did coaching start for you? What was your first coaching job and how did that job come about?
So, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a long story short, but I started off when I stopped playing football. I had no fun anymore in the game. Didn't enjoy it as much. Had an injury before, came back, but I knew it better than the coach, so to say. And then I decided, okay, this is not for me anymore. And then all of a sudden, I was 19, 18 years old. One of my neighbors from the village I was living in at that moment came to me asking if I could train his son. And there it all happened and started and went off. And yeah, I call it always a hobby which walked out of hand massively.
So would you say then that your coaching journey, if you like, is a bit emergent? You didn't really have plans necessarily to sort of reach the level of coaching you're at now, or?
In the beginning, I didn't have any plans. It was just for fun. Then I got asked to go to like the Dutch FA has several regions where they train young kids. So at least that was that moment in time. I'm not sure if it still happens. Who were the better players of the region? They trained every Sunday, and they asked me if I wanted to be part of this. And from there, it began. And when I started to think about planning, then it was in my time when I entered the first time Ajax that I realized, okay, I experienced now a year. What's next? That was the first time really that I started to plan forward with a conscious idea.
Was there anything particular about those experiences at Ajax that made you think, well, I could make a career out of this, or I want to stay in football?
No, I really enjoyed it. That was the first thing. And I also saw the efforts you have to make and the things you have to do in order to get there. So if you want to do such a thing, especially with not having a football background as a footballer yourself, you need to be smart and need to add something towards the environment. Yeah. And therefore, you need a little bit of planning. It's not really planning like it's step A, B, C, but more an abstract thing like, okay, what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Where can I benefit? And where can I, add something towards this environment?
So for you, what is that key strength that you were adding at the time to that kind of environment?
Looking back, I'm not so sure if and this is the funny thing always when you look back, I'm not so sure what this strength was, but I think it was supporting, helping out, being there with the different glasses on, if you know what I mean, because a lot of people there were former players and had their perspective, whereas I had at that moment in time a bachelor's in organization science, and this was a different background, and therefore I had more of an analytical point of view and an abstract point of view, making me, I think, in hindsight, a little addition towards this environment.
So what you've touched on there is something that we spoke to a lot of our guests about actually in season 1 of the podcast, about this kind of a split journey, if you like. They've got this coaching journey, their coaching profession, their qualifications, but then they've also got a bit of an academic side on them as well. And, you know, lots of people, we talked again in the podcast about this being perhaps somewhat artificial. You know, there shouldn't be necessarily a split between the academic and the coaching. But for you, you know, what's your perspective on that? Did you feel like you had a bit of a split and that's what helped you to bring the value? Or?
It's not a split. It's a difficult thing. I always thought it was a split, and I spoke with Robin Jones a lot about this when I was in Cardiff, because I thought there was a split, and he always said, "Oh, is there? And I was like, yes, there is, but I'm not so sure if it is now. If I look back, and also if you look now, the reason why is that theory tells practice, and practice tells theory, in a sense. And what is different is that theory never applies really fully in practice. However, the glimpses of it, or the abstract view of things, is coming back. And therefore, if you have the theoretical knowledge in your pocket, in your locker, then I think you are able to see, reflect, and absorb things in a slightly different manner, because you're more full grounded or full grained. How would you say this in English? But that you are more aware of certain things because of the theoretical understanding.
Yeah, I think it speaks a little bit to, I mean, lots of conversations that we've had on the DSC, and we'll talk about that journey in just a moment, but about really kind of living your theory. You know, the theory is a part of you. It's not just something that you can switch off and on. It's there with you. So those wider experiences and learning that you take from, I guess in this case, that artificial split, academic into coaching, helps you to maybe see things slightly differently in your coaching. I guess you and I would be somewhat similar, really. I kind of see that the added value that I bring to tennis coaching comes from that slightly more abstract view of things. And I guess I call it abstract because it's stuff, it's ideas that aren't really touched in formal governing body qualifications, and it's not really part of the discourse in the sport in general. So I guess that's where you and I would align a little bit.
Yeah, and yet, and this is something I think which is important to mention, there is a distinction, because, for example, if I give now to practitioners an academic paper, they will throw it away because they won't go through it. And this is, I believe, where the split happens. And this is in my opinion, a not needed split, because at the end of the day, it's good to have theoretical background, and it's good to have this theoretical abstraction. However, especially coaching is a very practical thing, because it is something you do. It needs to be understood by people who also do it. So although I also understand there needs to be an academic view on things, academic abstraction, it's also an art then to bring this back to how can we use this in practice.
Yeah, and I guess that's where some of the rationale of your thesis comes to the fore a little bit, and we will talk about that in a lot of detail later on in the episode. But let's talk about your time in Cardiff. You were a student on the Doctorate in Sport Coaching. At the same time, I think you were coaching at West Brom at the time with the academy players there. Tell us a little bit about your time on the DSC, how that supported you in your coaching roles at the time, and what that's added to you as far as your learning and your career development.
So before I did the PhD, I was at Hartpury and did my master's there, and also worked at West Brom. So it was to a degree the same as back then. The only difference was that with the DSC, it was really going back into coaching and deepening coaching in certain areas. I think it was phenomenology, it was pedagogy, it was it also high performance environment, Mike? I even forgot.
Critical, creative, transformative thinking, perhaps?
Thank you very much. And these kind of things were really adding towards things I did in practice. So what we had was was it every Thursday? Was it? Yeah, it was every Thursday. We sat down and we had two different modules running at the same time. And we were there with the likes of you, so a tennis coach, golf coach, an athletics coach, a rugby coach, and me, and another football coach. And we came back with the ideas we had the week earlier, the theory we had the week earlier, and how we brought this to practice in our own environment, so to say, and what we experienced back then, and what it did and what it meant. And we deepened certain, how would you say, parts of coaching into a very, very deep discussion sometimes, which went far off practice, but was very interesting to unpack and then bring back to how do we bring this to practice again. So it was, in a way, very, very philosophical, very academic. And then the beauty of it all was that at the end, you walked out of the door and you were like, this I'm going to do in my practice in this and this and this way. And therefore, at the same time, it was very hands-on.
Yeah, you sort of, you're reminding me of a kind of the very deep deconstructive element of the class where you come back in and tell everyone about what we've been trying to do in our practice, and you pull it apart, try and make sense of it, try and make sense of the theory that was shining through. But when you leave the classroom, you've got ideas of how you're going to do it again the next time. There's that reconstructive element to it. And I do remember actually struggling with one of the concepts in phenomenology, and you told me a little bit about a session that you've been running at West Brom, where you split the session into, I think, 3 30-minute segments, and you gave each of the segments just a word for players to focus on. I think it was to do with passing. So you used the word precision, maybe, purpose, perhaps, and I forget the other word, but I remember leaving the classroom and thinking, okay, I've got something here. I've got something that I can really use to impact my players. So your ideas were hugely beneficial for me, hugely influential on me as well. And hopefully, well, I mean, you're telling a story of lots of different sports in the DSE classroom there. We were all quite influential on each other there. So I think that was really a really valuable part of the DSE, was having such a mixture of coaching backgrounds in there.
Yeah, and that is, looking also back, this is one of the things which is like invaluable to a lot of coaches. If you are in one sport, you always meet up with coaches from the same sport, so to say. Especially in football, this is often the case. And what was very enlightening for me was that there were same sort of problems in coaching or in the environment, but coming back in a different manner. I remember you, for example, telling me about that you had 3 phases in tennis: playing attacking, playing defensive, and playing neutral. And I couldn't get my hand around, but it's just another way of framing a game. And this you can also do in football, where, for example, if the ball is shot high up in the air, and that you say, okay, this is a neutral standpoint, it can. It's just a matter of thinking in a different light. And therefore, is it then interesting to take this on board or not? Or is this word neutral maybe very interesting in order to tell the players in a certain game-based approach, okay, if you're 2-0 up, you have to kill the game, we say normally in football, but then start to play more neutral instead of that you start to attack, because in an attack it's more like that you have to go forward. Maybe it's a semantical discussion, but at least it tells you something about the depth of the DSC, that you start to rethink everything and start to make sense of certain things better.
Yeah, I remember that conversation about neutrality, and we talked about it in lots of different scenarios. I mean, ice hockey with Dean came up in conversation, and some concepts there, and we talked about it in rugby with Gethin, etc. And the level of depth that we got into just about, like you say, a potentially semantic word in the word neutral was quite something. And I sort of picture that level of depth not being something really that you'll get to in a formal coaching qualification, or even necessarily out in the wider working world. It's quite challenging to find the time and the space and the culture, I suppose, to have those deeper conversations about something that seems so small and almost so insignificant. Is there anything that you're doing in your work now to try and create opportunities for those levels of conversation, or are they fewer and further between nowadays?
Well, now with the current role, it is a lot about, I don't have a lot of time for myself. I purposefully need to make time for myself. It's something I miss sometimes, in all fairness, but you just step down and want to unpack certain things or have certain conversations. If in all honesty, I have to say now, I have more practical and, how would you say, hands-on discussions than having a step back and more having an abstract discussion. The reason why is a twofold. First and foremost, there are not a lot of people who can have this abstract discussion. And second, in all fairness, if I am done for a day, it's like normally it's 6 to 7 days a week. So if I'm then off for a day, or if I have 1 hour in the day where I can relax a little bit, the last thing I think about is complexity, because then it's like everything what happened in the day or in the week sinks in, and then I have to make practical use of this time in order to search for solutions or those kind of things. So in a way, I really miss it.
Do you think then, particularly when we're thinking about coaches' development in mind, there needs to be a bit more of a conscious effort to make those spaces for coaches to really think and to have the time to engage in that slightly more detailed level of conversation?
In an ideal world, I would say yes, because it brings you a step further, or you can do a step back. And what I also experienced last summer, for example, when you have this break, or in the Christmas break, maybe the upcoming Christmas break, you have more time because you're a few days off in a row. And then it's possible to do these kind of things. And I think it's also needed to do these kind of things, because if you solve the problem, sometimes you can avoid the problem. And by avoiding the problem, you save a lot of time you have to solve the problem, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So, and with this, I mean, avoiding the problem can often be that you do things from a more abstract perspective, take the helicopter view, as I always say it, and are able to manage or think in a certain way. So the problems which occur on your daily basis won't affect you, or can be managed more easily on a daily basis. And therefore, it's very important to have these more in-depth discussions more often. Yeah. Make sense what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's quite you talk about abstract concepts. It's quite an abstract idea to think about being able to solve problems before they even happen. I think, module 1 of the DSC, we talk about a concept like that. I want to say it's Cropley and Cropley. Creative people are those that solve problems before those problems exist. You've worded it as, take the helicopter view, distance yourself, take a step back, have a look at the bigger picture, get away from the everydayness of coaching, just the day-to-day, not monotony, but almost repetition and just seeing things, or not being able to see things because you're so close to them, and actually being able to step back and say, look, these are the problems that might occur when we try this approach. So let's fix them now before we even jump in. I think it's quite a novel idea. It's not something that I think many coaches have, at least I've seen in their practice, engage with. So certainly some value there, I think.
The value for me is that if you do these kind of things, that everything becomes more easy. So if it is about emotional attachment, or that because of your own personality that you are unhappy or something like this, that it doesn't get under your skin, this is easily manageable if you take the abstract and can relativate the things which happen in front of you, if you know what I mean. Whereas sometimes you get caught up in the moment, and then you you hit the wall a few times because you get more emotional, or you get you say certain things you shouldn't say, those kind of elements, which only make more and more problems, if you know what I mean. So in this way, it can be very beneficial, and not only in this way, but also in your coaching. If you enter the pitch, what can happen? What will happen? How can I avoid that this happens? Or maybe I have to add this rule. So then it already occurs instead of me having to say it. So this is also always what I say as well. If you plan your training session properly, it saves you a lot of words, and therefore your words get more powerful, because the session itself will take your words away. If you make certain rules that certain things already appear, then you don't have to tell it. You just have to mention, hey, what happens, and can correct it already. And this for me is a very important thing to have in mind. And this is maybe a good example of taking problems away before they already come there.
Yeah, it's good. I really like the idea of maybe trying to take a little bit more care with the words that you want to use. You can think about them a little bit more in that planning phase. I mean, those speak to me about my coaching will know that I'm not a big fan necessarily of being over the top with planning. I don't really go in for the idea of trying to make an all singing, all dancing plan structure. I like some loose lines of thought that I want to follow, but I'll still think carefully about what it is I want to actually achieve from the session. So I think there's a really nice message from you there. We've talked a little bit about your academic journey then as well, but you're also currently a candidate on the pro license. So how's your pro license going?
Yeah, it's good. I really like it. I do the pro license in England. So, and the reason there was that I had my English A license already. So I had the opportunity to join, and yeah, I very much enjoy it. It's also hands-on, but with a lot of lenses from different perspectives. So we had a heart surgeon coming in, explaining how he copes with the pressure and still leads under this pressure. I think it were even 11 other people who helped him with an open heart transplantation. And he showed some videos and helped us out. But at the same time, we also had musical producers in who let us, well, we came in the room, and then all of a sudden, when we left the room, we had sang, danced, and did some performance with each other. And you have to know that football coaches are quite conservative, and the first thing they will do is reject these kind of things. So, and the whole thing for me was the message they brought towards us that we didn't even recognize and couldn't say no, if you know what I mean, in order to do this kind of things. I really liked how they did it. And also we have assignments. So for this assignment, you had to visit the high performance environment, and I went to see in the Rijksmuseum, you have the Night Watch, and it's currently being restored for a few years already. And I went behind the scenes in order to see how they do these kind of things and to what level of detail they go in terms of the light in order to repair or paint needs to be on, what was it? I don't even know, but let's say 10.2 centimeters away from, because this is the ideal distance in order to see the best, but also that you don't hurt the painting the most. And it's incredible to what level of detail these guys go and how they work under severe pressure, because what they do is that they have this big painting in a box. They are repairing the painting live where there is audience around. And this is sort of, so they told me, educational way of keeping the painting for the audience, but also educate people what it means to repair such a precious thing. And this was fascinating, and I can go into far more detail, but it was really high performing environment, and it was an environment I didn't knew before. In all fairness, I didn't like museums. But now with my girlfriend, I visited a lot of museums because something triggered me in there. I really liked it.
What's intriguing me is that I've asked you about a pro license and you've ended up talking about lighting and artwork and stuff that's not football necessarily, but you found them so incredibly helpful. And we talked a moment ago about you learning a lot from coaches from other sports outside of football. Why is it that you think you feel so much benefit from things that aren't necessarily football for your coaching?
Because for me, football is an environment where I am always be influenced by. The bits and bobs in the game, the perspectives on the game. We can talk a lot about tactics, and this I also really like. But it's really refreshing to visit an environment which is also high performing and have to cope with certain elements in the same sort of way, but do it in a totally different way and go into a certain level of detail in the night watch example. Such an amount of level of detail that I'm thinking, how can we bring this to football? Or how can I bring this to my own coaching? Where in my coaching can I think about an example where the light has to be 10.2 centimeters away from, that level of detail? Maybe I can, and this challenges me to think about myself, the environment you create, the players you train with, how you give feedback to them, the staff. So this is maybe my strange head or my strange brain, but it starts to ignite ideas.
Mm. You feel that sort of that sense of passion sort of spreads throughout the team that you're working with. So you've got assistant coaches and various different support staff in the team. When you bring these ideas back to Anderlecht, for example, do you feel like those ideas have influence then over other people within the team? Is it a tough sell sometimes? You talked about coaches maybe sometimes rejecting ideas, or are you finding it achievable as such to really get these ideas across to the team and see their benefit almost immediately?
No, it's not that you always have the same answer or the same reaction of people around. Some really like it and understand what you mean. Some like it but don't understand what you mean, and some don't like it. And everything is fine. And some you therefore ignite also, like, oh, this is nice. Let's do something with it. Some are like, yeah, well, nice idea, nice things, but yeah, leave it where it is. And others say, well, I'm not too bothered to hear anymore. And this is also fine.
Yeah, because I wanted to speak to you a little bit about how you find, particularly, I suppose, within a context like football and at the level that you're coaching at and have coached before, how do you find that sort of negotiation of relationships with other people, with trying to find out the ways of working within the clubs that you're joining? How do you find yourself? How do you find your place within those different teams, particularly when you've got probably a slightly different background to everyone else, because you've got things like the DSC and the MSc and that sort of academic ideas? I'm sure you'd admit yourself that you're not, you've got more abstract ideas in relation to football, but you've still got to fit in, right? So how is it you go about that negotiation? Perhaps I'm putting you in a challenging spot here, but
No, not at all. It's just there to fail. Because you don't know. Sometimes you make an assumption someone can't understand what you say, but this is sometimes not the right assumption, and sometimes it's the other way around, that they understand that you think you understand they understand what you say, but they actually don't. And it's a matter of dare to speak about these abstract ideas. Don't bother about how they view you afterwards. And because you do these kind of things, people, and it's really you, so it's authentic, people will appreciate that at least, but also you will understand better what is their interest, what is their capacity in order to think abstract at that moment in time, because it's always developed, can always be developed. Maybe you trigger certain people by doing it, but at this the most important is to dare and do it and fail. And sometimes you bump your head into a wall, but then you learn from it again. I'm not too bothered about failing because I hope that I fail a lot, because that means that I can also learn a lot. But if I avoid failing, if I avoid doing these things, I know one thing for sure, that I will not know myself better. I don't know the content better, and also don't know the people who are in front of me better. So therefore, I think the only benefit is to fail.
Which is a really interesting story, because if we talk about assumptions, there's, I guess, this assumption, particularly in top flight football, that it's very cutthroat. There's not much room for you to make mistakes. There's not much room for you to make too many mistakes. And so I would almost sort of see what you're doing there.
Why isn't that so much room?
Well, I guess, again, this is completely my naivete and lack of knowledge really about football shining through here. But because football is or seems to be so much about results, and so much about winning, and so much about money, even quite a lot of the time, that you can't make the mistakes that are going to cost you results, or too many of them. You can't keep dropping points week after week after week, because people start asking questions and wondering why you're still coach, and you come under a lot of criticism, a lot of fire. It's a very public domain that you're working in that sort of area, with social media nowadays, particularly. But I guess there's that. I live in a work in a luxurious environment of a small tennis center in the smallest country, or one of the smallest countries in the UK, and I'm sort of hidden away a little bit, and I have a bit more freedom and agency to make those mistakes. But there's perhaps a perception, maybe this is my perception, but I'm sure there's a slightly wider perception that football perhaps doesn't quite have the same amount of space and luxury for those mistakes as such.
And here I agree, but this is only about the performance in the weekend. And also the performance in the weekend, you can't avoid that there are mistakes, because otherwise every game would be 0-0 or 10-10. But for me, it's important that you make the mistakes once and then learn from it in order to avoid the mistake later on. And this is then learning. And then if they make the mistakes 3 or 4 times the same mistake, then we have a problem. Here I agree. But you can't avoid that you make mistakes. I think you have to celebrate making mistakes in a way, in order to learn from them and become a better team, a better individual, a better coach. And therefore, in training or in certain occasions, you can make these mistakes in order to become better together. And I totally get your point, but in some way I disagree, because how can you grow together if you don't make mistakes? Because then you stay in yours. I always say a mistake is opening your box a little bit. As long as you want to, and you dig into the problem occurring towards the mistake. If you think about, we make a mistake, okay, let's continue, and you make the same mistake again, like I told earlier, then you keep on being in the same cycle. However, if you make a mistake, you unpack, you repair, and then you try again. And then you can also make a mistake later down the line, but then you can unpack again. And the mistake will not be as big as it was before.
Yeah.
This is, and I know it's theory, but I really believe in this core thought of a mistake is not specifically bad. Yes, on the moment when you make a mistake in the match and you lose therefore 1-0, it's bad. But it's more, how do you cope with the mistake? How do you learn from the mistake? And this is in whole life. So in my academic, you know better than me, sometimes I was saying certain things which was maybe a little bit inappropriate or a little bit challenging in certain ways. But at least you learn from that, and it becomes a real discussion. And in order to do so and have this environment where mistakes are doable, it's very important for me as a head coach to bring safety, clarity, and a certain, how would you say it, continuity in my coaching. So if I say what day one, it's no problem to make mistakes. And the first time a guy makes a mistake, for example, in a match, costing us a match, then my whole trustworthiness is gone, if you know what I mean. So it's about this continuity.
Yeah, it speaks a little bit to that sort of authenticity that you mentioned a little while ago. It's very authentic Marink, I suppose, that mistakes should be seen as an opportunity rather than a real problem. And it's, something that needs to be immediately fixed and pulled apart, etc. It's actually more of an experience that one can learn from instead, which I think is again something that's probably underappreciated maybe in the wider field of sport coaching.
And don't get me wrong, if we lose a match because of that, I will be pissed off, not because of the mistake per se, but that we lose. So you also need to be a human being, but at the same time, you have to have in your back of your mind, it needs to be there in order to progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really important messages. I think really valuable messages for the coaches certainly that are listening to this episode. Hopefully they're taking a lot from it. I did want to designate some time this morning to talk to you about your thesis.
Yeah.
Because not only is your thesis written through, I guess, a phenomenological approach, which is something that we've spoken about with other guests in season 2 thus far, but also because I know you had a desire, particularly when you first started the DSC, that sort of carried through into your research, that you wanted to write it in a way that it became more accessible to coaches, more accessible to a wider audience. You weren't a particular fan of high-end abstract academic language and writing and things like that. And I think there's some important messages in there. So was that the key inspiration about, around the thesis? Were there other ideas that were shining through that really kind of drove you to, I want to do something that's about the phenomenology of my coaching. I want to really get into what it is that I do, but I want to present it in a way that everyone can attach themselves to it.
So the two core things for me were, at the end of the day, I invest a lot of time in this work, and so it needs to benefit me. And benefit me can be in several ways. But in the context, I was working in first team football at that moment in time when I made the decision to do this. Plus, I was very, very interested in the way we approached the things, and this I missed then when we did the research project in the DSC, where you bounce off ideas and you bring it to your own practice and how you can evolve your own practice because of that. Therefore, I picked this topic. And the second thing for me was that in my master's, I wrote a nice thesis in an academic way, and everybody I gave it to, because they participated or they are close to my heart, said like, yeah, well, nice, but I can't read through it. And then this also put on a certain light in my head, like, hey, so I put a lot of work in. They really appreciate that I bring this, but they don't know and will not dig into the content, whereas they mostly always worked in football or in coaching or with teachers. And therefore I was like, yeah, this is a waste of time, whereas it shouldn't be a waste of time, if you know what I mean with that. So this ignited in me, like, the next time I'm going to do such a thing, and I knew that I have to do this for my PhD as well, then I will make sure that it is also practically understood or understandable.
So why don't we work our way from sort of top to the bottom of the thesis? I mean, we haven't got the hours and hours on end to really pull it apart, but I think the structure in and of itself is a good conversation topic to have. And the thesis itself is actually available on Figshare. So our listeners, will make sure we link it into the podcast description, and our listeners can go and have a read of it if they choose to. I'm sure they will. Your introduction was a bit of a metaphor for your relationship with your research and doing the thesis. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so basically in the moment of making this thesis, it was more that it was, a yes, I want, but no, I don't want, and a conflict in my own head. And sometimes, some days, I wanted to throw my laptop out of the window, and sometimes I loved it, and it was a real struggle. And this struggle I wrote down in the introductory vignette, I think, and I think throughout the whole thesis, you can read my struggle, because it's a sort of a story which I try to tell. But the introduction is more a metaphor on dancing. So, do I take the woman's hand in order to dance, or can't I? And then I describe some problems and thoughts I have with this. And my dancing partner is at that moment, is it phenomenology, or the thesis itself. And by doing this metaphor, I think there is a better understanding of my internal struggle. But at the same time, also I believe the struggle a lot of thesis writers will have at the end. And and it was, in my opinion, immediately a catch in towards the reader who, if you like this metaphor, I think you liked also the next parts of the thesis, if you know what I mean. And if you don't like it, you can put it away. So it's more of an invitation to the reader in order to tempt them to know more, which I believe worked out also okay, well, because the people who told me this, like, now I'm curious to know more about this thesis. So, yeah, and and again, it's about practicality. It's about making it practice, tempting. It's because this is also, if I read the abstracts or the introduction things on normal papers, I was like, my gosh, what a, I don't even know what I just read there, because it's like 3 sentences and I have to read them again and again and again. And it's about this. But then I was already like, I will throw it away now, because come on. And I knew there is a lot of nice and interesting knowledge in there, but it's written in such a very structured and not approachable way that I was like, come on.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose that really shines through in the introduction, in that metaphor. You're dancing with a partner, the partner being the thesis, who has danced a very particular way for such a long time and is perhaps not going to be all that malleable, is not going to follow the steps that you want to take necessarily. And so really you tell a story all the way through the thesis about how you've come to terms with that, but also how you've tried to wrestle the thesis into a new direction, into new pieces of footwork, etc. And one of the ways that you've done that is through using a phenomenological lens to understand your coaching. It is very much an area, I think, in research that needs more time, I think, in sport coaching generally, and Robin has spoken to this as well. Phenomenology is something that we need to be doing a little bit more just as a discipline about what is coaching. Before we get into your results of the thesis and some of the other vignettes that you've written for us, what was the rationale for phenomenology? Why phenomenology? Because it's a hard word to say in the first place, let alone try and get to grips with as far as a theoretical and philosophical perspective. So what was it that sold you on that?
Because it goes, you can see things from a different perspective. So basically it's going back to the origins of things, phenomenology. And this can be done in several ways. And I decided to do more that I always try to make it applicable. So you have your glasses on, you have your own viewpoint, your own glasses on, but you can be aware that you have your own glasses on. And by having this awareness, how can I then see things in a different perspective? I found it fascinatingly interesting, because for me in coaching, this is what you constantly have to do. And it's really hard to bracket yourself out. So this is what Husserl, I can't, I always called him Hustler, but I can't say this on the podcast, do I? He says that you can see things from without a perspective, and Heidegger said more like you can see it with your own perspective, so to say. that you are aware of your own perspective. And this approach appealed to me because it makes, well, this is what I always tried to do in coaching. I think it was unconscious, and I wasn't aware that you do this, but when I read it and get a better understanding of this approach, it's not really an approach, but it's more the philosophical idea. I thought this would be very interesting for coaches, because at the end of the day, you deal with all different kinds of people with all different kinds of perspectives and all different kinds of social, cultural, historical background, in order to get a better understanding of the individual or the team in front of you. And in order to do so, I then have to understand my own glasses, and then also can see things from a different light. Yeah. This was the initial thought. Why?
And what were the principal challenges for you then with trying to take that approach? Did you find yourself almost masked to those external or different ways of thinking somewhat? You know, how did you get around, or what strategies did you use to try and, you know, heighten your awareness of the glasses you were wearing and expose yourself to new ideas?
Well, the first thing I got to do this was with the module Phenomenology on the course. And here I really struggled by doing those kind of things, because it's very because normally you are you. Yeah. And it's really difficult to take a step back while being on the pitch and have to lead, for example. But by trying to, and sometimes literally physically stepping back while they are playing, then you step back and you really think like, okay, what do I see here, and why do I see what I see, and why don't I see something else? So where can I focus on in order to see more in the same observation, so to say? And that was the first steps. That were the first steps. And the thesis itself led me into a thought of, okay, but how do I see coaching? What is coaching exactly? If I unpack for myself what coaching is, I came to the conclusion that's three things: observation, interpretation, and articulation. And observation is what you see, but also what you feel with your body, because you don't always see with your eyes, you also see with your body in a certain way, because if you enter, let's say, a cold room, it does something with your observation because your body reacts on it. And therefore, it also gives you a certain feeling, and therefore it's also a form of observation. Then it was the interpretation. So if you have seen certain things, you interpret that based on your own lens. So it goes through your own filter. But in order to do this phenomenological bit, you need to understand your own filter, and then also be able to make your own filter bigger and broader, so to say. And because of those two, then it's a matter of articulation. And this can also be done in several ways, and depending on the individual in front of you, which you observed and interpreted, you have to you articulate certain things in a certain way to that particular individual. In other words, it was very difficult. But to give you a hands-on example, we had a left winger, and it's also in the thesis, I think, as an example. We had a left winger, which I saw not doing a sprint back of 5 to 10 meters in defense. My first interpretation was he's lazy. And then I went mental at him because I thought he was lazy, and I hate laziness, especially if you are so gifted as this guy was. And then this was for me my main enlightening moment. Hey, wait a minute. Why do I only see him? Is it not that within the whole team I have to see more in order to maybe understand his not running back better? Maybe a midfielder bumped on in order to cover his man. Can be. I didn't see, but I was so fixed on him. Why was I fixed on him? Then by him not running back, I was like, gee, my gosh, he's super lazy. And that, instead of like, hey, maybe he has an injury, maybe he saw something else, maybe he did it with an idea, not to sprint back. And then I went mental at him. Whereas maybe if the other two things that, or he got cover or he had a certain idea with it, made a very bad articulation from my side, and therefore changed the relationship with this player potentially. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
And this for me was like, wow, this is golden. If I can see this from a different angle, more helicopter view, and being not so biased by myself, then maybe this is something we can use. A long story, Mike, in order to explain why.
No, absolutely fine. And actually, what you've touched on there is, I suppose, part of the structure of the way that you've actually written your results. So, for the listeners, if you're having a scan through Marink's thesis now, or if you're going to visit it later, the results start with a vignette, an experience that you've had, Marink, that might be most of them completely unrelated to football. And then you've sort of reflected on that experience. You've talked about a session that's actually happened, where you've been able to link together almost those two experiences, or that experience and the reflection. Then it's followed then by a slightly deeper theoretical reflection on that experience. And the experience that you're talking about there is after having gone to an equine show, a horse jumping show.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that horse jumping show, and tell us just a little bit about this particular thread, because I really enjoyed reading this particular part. So
for me, it was like equine. I always thought the horse does the job, and how important is the jockey on the back of the horse. And so I went because I was at Hartbury, and Lisa, I will never forget this experience. I was at Hartbury, and I made a joke with the girls there, like, yeah, come on, what do you really do, blah blah blah. And at the end, they invited me to go to a show jumping event, and I was like, yeah, I will join you, but what does it matter? Huh? And I came there, and I was fascinated because I didn't. You call it the fences where they jump over, or how do you call this? So these fences were like super high, I think 1 meter 30, 1 meter 35. And they told me that those horses were afraid of these fences because of the colors and the texture of the fences itself, the structure. How do you say that? How it looks like? It scares the horse. So then I was like, okay, so if it scares the horse, and you have to jump over such a high fence, how on earth do you do this? And this for me was an eye-opener, because I was like, wow, this needs to be that you really understand the horse. You need to understand the certain parameters he will show to you in terms of body, heartbeat maybe, or body use and those kind of things, that I was like, okay, but it's never verbal communication. It's always non-verbal communication. And how on earth then, if you just do it on non-verbal communication, you know exactly what the horse wants. And this was at the end building a relationship, because then afterwards, after this event, I went with one of the girls in order to understand. And it was like that whole routine is about the horse. So in the morning, at 10 o'clock, at 12 o'clock, in the afternoon, hiking, then in the evening again. So your whole schedule is in and around the horse. But this builds a level of trust and ultimately understood. But for the vignette, I think I just touched upon this. This is a broader explanation of it. But this made me thinking, wow, how can we understand each other? Well, because we as human beings have the luckiness that we can also talk to each other, not only do it on body language, but these animals and the jockey can't do it with verbal language. It's just nonverbal language, and how do you do this? And this fascinated me to think about. At that moment in time, not phenomenology yet, but it was a good link in order to come back to the vignette I just wrote.
And that link then to the left winger you've sort of initially perceived as it's laziness, the relationship between rider and horse, I guess translates across a little bit to the relationship between you and athlete, and so you've decided, okay, I need to develop the relationship here. It's not so much about me criticizing or leaping to a criticism that it's lazy. It's actually developing that relationship, as it were. There's
and it comes back to comes back to making the mistake. If you know what we just spoke about earlier, if you dare to make a mistake, and also with the horses, sometimes you need to assume certain things in order to do something, because without seeing or assuming something, you can't do anything. And then maybe it's the wrong assumption, but then you also need to be, okay, maybe this was with the horse a wrong assumption. How can we do it differently in order that the horse reacts better on me? And this is a process of little errors, little mistakes, and then you go into a certain direction where you get a common understanding. And also with players, this is the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think a couple of valuable messages there about the importance of the relationship you have with your athletes, but also the inspiration that you've got that's led you towards that understanding of how to better build that relationship with an athlete has come from something completely separate from football. But you're able, by stripping away those lenses, those glasses a little bit, you're able to see some correlation from, well, in this case, horse riding, which I think is really important. It really sort of sends a message to coaches to read and to observe things a bit more widely than just the sport that they're actually working in. I know I'm guilty of this myself. You talked about it at the start. When you're in football, you speak to a lot of football coaches, actually taking the time to go and see other sports and hear from other coaches in other sports. I think a huge learning opportunity there for all coaches. Now, in the results, you also have two other vignettes, which we won't go into too much detail. We'll leave the readers with, or our listeners with some extra reading to do. But for some context, you talk about an experience of being angry with another driver on the M4, an experience that many of us, particularly in Wales, can relate to. And then also a story of a bird that mimics the calls of meerkats in order to pinch their food. And you liken that a little bit to a new signing joining the club at the time. So there's some really quite abstract stories and vignettes that you've presented that really act as quite nice hooks for the reader. So as I said, I'll put the link to the thesis in the podcast episode description, would definitely advocate that our readers go and have a look at that. Let's talk a little bit about your outroduction then. So again, this thesis was not written in a traditional manner, I suppose, and you've created an outroduction. And in that outroduction, you explain how perhaps your relationship with the research and the thesis has changed when the lights come on at the end of the dance, so to speak. Why don't you finish off the story of your thesis with a bit of an overview of that for us?
When I was done with the thesis, at least, well, you think you're done, but now, Mike, the last bits are also like terrible because you have to review. But at least when I wrote this, I was like, okay, now the lights come on, and in a sort of way, it took me into a certain direction which I really liked, really appreciated. Never been before, will never. I can't say never, but will not be in often again, if you know what I mean, and have the time in order to get this information, a deeper understanding of one specific specialized topic. And when it was done, and this is always with the thing, we have a Dutch song which says, a man doesn't know what he misses, but if she is not there, then a man knows what he is missing. And this is a little bit the same thing, that while you were doing the thesis, I didn't appreciate that much. It was like this little fight where we spoke about, but looking back on it, it is something I appreciate. It's not my specific cup of tea, like it's my bread and butter, but I also am now more towards, okay, but it's part of me. It's part of who I am, and it's something I'm happy that I did. because it gave me so much knowledge, insights, friendships, and different perspectives that this I will carry with me all the time. And this dance we spoke about when the lights came on will always be a part of me, which I really appreciate.
Is there anything that you miss most about doing that research?
Not about the research per se, but more the past in the week where you can speak with like-minded people from different perspectives and different backgrounds and sports in order to discuss deep subjects or subjects in a deep manner. This sometimes I miss. About the project itself, in all fairness, I disliked to detach myself from, because I made the decision that I took a step away for a year from football in order to finish this. So it took me more or less a year. And this was not the most easiest time because I'm not per se a research tiger. I'm not per se a massive fan of reading the papers, as I already mentioned, and I was not a massive writer talent, so to say. But it taught me a lot of things I never thought I was capable of doing so. B, at the end starting to like, because you got better and better at it. And this is from the research perspective what I don't miss, because at the end of the day, again, it's not my bread and butter, but it's something I really appreciate that I've done and had the resilience to and the opportunity to do it in the way I wanted to do it.
Great. So we're about an hour on the clock now. We've been going for a little while. It's gone incredibly quick for me. Hopefully it's gone quick for you as well, Marink. So let's talk a little bit about what's next for you. What's next for Marink Reedijk? Dr. Marink Reedijk, I should say.
No, don't say the doctor. What's next for me? Good question. I always have this little thing in mind that you have to enjoy the things you do. And as long as you enjoy, keep on doing the things you do. And if there is no enjoyment anymore, I will do something else. And this is something in my thoughts always, like, am I doing the right things because I want it or because I like it? And if it's the combination, it's the best. But at the end, it should be that I like it. As we do it here in football, like 6-7 days a week, and probably other coaches do the same. The time and effort you have to put in, you need to be very sure that it is the thing you like. Because if you start to doubt this, then if I started out, maybe I have to say it like this, if I start to doubt it, then I will do something different. Because at the end of the day, you have one, time is the most valuable thing for me, and therefore you need to fill your time in the best way possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final segment of the podcast is to give you a platform for 2 or 3 minutes to have a bit of a rant. It could be a myth in sport coaching that you've come across. It could be someone's sort of misconception about what coaching is really like. It could be something that you've seen on Instagram or Twitter or in the news, and you just want to address it and put it to bed. So is there anything that vexes you particularly? Is there anything that you'd like to address to finish off the podcast?
I think it's about the importance of data in football nowadays. Don't get me wrong, it's important, but only if it is contextual towards playing style and towards physical parameters important within that playing style. And it's only a resource in order to reflect. Therefore, it should be used accordingly and carefully. Because if we make judgments, human judgments with numbers, I think this is a little bit dangerous always to do this like this, because it's not representing a context, not representing, or just representing a moment can also be. So it should be more about relevance of data, and then also what do you do with the data? Is it a leading, or is it a tool in order to construct a result. And you construct the result also with qualitative data, sorry. So not only quantitative data. And I am more of a believer that it should be a mixture, and it's not always a need to measure certain things within numbers. I mean, you can also measure it in qualitative way of approach. And hopefully, and it's not only in football, but also in normal life, we come back towards a certain balance in these two things where we understand each other better because we have a better relation because of qualitative way of doing things. And then also can measure this by a quantitative way, tailor-made quantitative way, I have to say, in order to reflect properly on. And this is something what bothers me, because people hide behind certain numbers without having the context, and it seems all nice and all truth, but is it really? So being critical about this is, I think, one of the things important in sports, in football, in sports, but also maybe in normal life. At least this is sometimes where I struggle with.
Yeah. I think a really prudent message to finish, particularly given society's, I suppose, current behavior towards data. Data seems to almost rule all in lots of different contexts. And I completely agree with you. I think overlooking the human side, that qualitative side, I think is dangerous. I think we almost strip ourselves a bit of agency just by putting things on numbers, and ultimately it's always going to be about us, isn't it? As coaches, as practitioners, as teachers, as human beings. It's a bit more about what we see and what we feel. So
it's for me also interesting. Also, I understand why it's been so like on the forefront, because it's not easy, but it gives you a certain handhold, and it's like then the truth, so to say. But what it lacks then is that this craft of understanding someone else better, like the phenomenology, so this, I really think it's a craft in order to understand other people in a certain way. And this is the fallacy of having so much data, is that we don't understand this anymore and have this relationship anymore. And this is what sometimes the things, unfortunately, which are missing.
Good. Thank you for that, Marink. So all that leaves me with now is just to say a huge thank you to Marink for joining us on today's episode of the podcast. Thank you for joining us, Marink.
Again, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Thank you to everyone in our sport broadcast team as well for supporting the podcast. Huge thank you to all of our listeners that are engaging with us week by week as well. We'll be back with another episode very soon. In the meantime, make sure you go back and listen to some of our other episodes. Make sure to leave us a review on the podcast platform that you're listening in on. Leave us some feedback and make sure you subscribe, and we'll be back next time with another episode. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media.
All the links to our social medias are in the podcast description below.